Welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Institute online Lincoln Symposium. My name is Michelle A. Crowell, and I will serve as your host of this series through May 3rd. This live stream Speakers Symposium is focused on the life, times, and legacy of President Abraham Lincoln. You can learn more about the Lincoln Symposium event schedule by visiting the Ford's Theater website at www.fords.org or the Abraham Lincoln Institute website at www.lincoln-institute.org. A note to all our viewers, we are taking your questions on our social media platforms. Later in the program, we will have a Q&A section with today's speakers, moderated by my colleague, Jonathan W. White. Please feel free to submit your questions so that we may share them with the speakers then. Finally, the Abraham Lincoln Institute would like to take this opportunity to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Gary Erskine, Carolina Dulce, Lauren B.A., Juliana Avery, Andrea Bowman, and the staff of Ford's Theater for all their hard work to make this virtual symposium possible. Our first speaker is Lucas E. Morel, the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Professor Morel lectures in summer programs for the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy, and conducts high school teacher workshops for organizations including the Jack Miller Center, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and the John M. Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. He is a former president and current board member of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, charged with planning activities to commemorate the founding of the United States. Professor Morel is the author of Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, and Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding, part of the Concise Lincoln Library series of Southern Illinois University Press. Speaking today on Lincoln, the Founding, and the Challenge of Self-Government, we welcome Lucas Morel to the program.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, John and Erica and all the folks at Ford's Theater. You guys always do such a terrific job putting on these programs. We'll get right to it. If they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy back in the antebellum era, in Lincoln's day, his carriage would say, "I heart the American founding." In my book, Lincoln and the American Founding, I argue that there was no greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men, and especially the leading ideas that shaped America's revolution and early constitutional formation. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the founder, and that, of course, means George Washington. So in my book, I start with the influence of Washington on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver, establisher, and defender of American self-government. But for Lincoln, more important than a founding man was a founding document, and that was the Declaration of Independence. On the way to his first inauguration as president, Lincoln said, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So in chapter 2 of my book, I explore how Lincoln was shaped by key principles of the Declaration and its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. If the Declaration spells out the purpose or aim of the American regime, chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government, and these are found in the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached a reverence for the Constitution and laws, as well as the more perfect union of American states that the Constitution established. Of course, you can't read the Declaration and then the Constitution and not notice a few provisions where the Constitution did not align itself completely or consistently with the noble aims of the Declaration. And so in chapter 4, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founders' compromise with slavery, the institution that contradicted the founding experiment in self-government. My final chapter explains Lincoln's understanding of original intent as a political practice. In short, why should we follow the founders? This chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the American founding in light of progress, experience, and the responsibility of each generation to govern themselves under the Constitution in light of the ideals, as Lincoln understood them, of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln believed that during his fractious times, looking back to the founding could help Americans move forward. He did this most famously in his Gettysburg Address. That speech begins at the nation's beginning. fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He takes his audience back not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence, not to the body, but to the soul of America. Lincoln goes on to explain that the Civil War was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In the midst of a fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought the nation would benefit from looking to its past. Americans needed a reminder of why preserving the Union was so important. With Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other, it's safe to say there was some confusion about the meaning of America. They were no longer united in their understanding of why the nation existed. What were its fundamental aims and purposes? So in the middle of this fratricidal war, Lincoln wanted Americans to recommit themselves, to dedicate themselves to the task that remained, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining that effort, an effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. Recall that Lincoln delivered his short speech, his few appropriate remarks, in the year of Jubilee, the year of emancipation. Union soldiers and sailors were now charged by the president to protect the freedom of over 3 million legally freed Black Americans. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, if you will, the Declaration of Independence. Its central idea that all men are created equal described the natural condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln didn't announce a new principle of freedom, but he affirmed an old one he learned from the founding fathers when they declared independence. Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work to which the living, all Americans, could dedicate themselves. They could thus honor the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. This was no Civil War epiphany of Lincoln's. In February 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped in Trenton, the capital of New Jersey, and where he was hosted by the state Senate. I'm exceedingly anxious that this Union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. Lincoln's election had provoked white citizens of 7 slaveholding states to reject the authority of the federal government, as they feared the incoming Republican Party would fail to protect their right to take slaves into the federal territories. But in the decade leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln's main political target was not slave-owning Southerners, but complacent white Northerners, especially led by his rival, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty because it was neutral on the slave question. Douglas believed that whites at the local level, whether in the states or federal territories, had the right to decide the question without any interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States would be determined not by a majority of all Americans, but by a very small minority of the settlers in the territories. In reference to the enslavement of Black people, way out west, Douglas said, "I don't care whether it be voted up or voted down." This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to eliminating slavery in the United States was Douglas teaching white Northerners to become indifferent to the plight of Black people in the federal territories. And this is how Lincoln put it. They tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution. Just as certain, but more dangerous, because more insidious. But it is leading us there just as certainly and as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. What made Douglas's don't care policy in the territories so insidious to Lincoln was that for slavery to become national, no politician north of the Mason-Dixon line needed to argue in favor of slavery. Simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if Black slavery expanded into the federal territories. Once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in the territories, it would soon become legal in the free states, regardless of the Constitution or laws of that state. In his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, coupled with the recent Dred Scott decision, 1857, this would produce precisely this outcome in the not too distant future. By straying from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country Lincoln no longer recognized. And so he looked to what he called our revolutionary fathers for aid. Looking back to the founders couldn't have been more relevant to the crisis the nation faced in the 1850s. And Lincoln wasn't the only one appealing to the fathers. Stephen Douglas was the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician of the 1850s. And he claimed that he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought about the question of slavery. Douglas claimed his policy aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new American Republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and the eventual abolition of slavery depended on whose interpretation of the founders was correct and could best reunite a divided country. With the population growing faster in the free states than in the slaveholding states, the future of slavery in America would be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery in the only land possessed by the American people at large, the federal territories. However, tempted by Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty, so-called, as it applied to the Nebraska Territory in 1854, slavery's fate might be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest, meaning those who could profit by taking Black slaves into the territories. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress didn't have authority to regulate it, then his declared indifference would actually represent, in Lincoln's mind, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of Black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people who did not look like them, enslaved Blacks in the South, potentially being taken into federal territory, had anything to do with the kind of country in which they wanted to live. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found in the thinking and practice of the American founders. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as the generations that followed in the early republic, acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They did so by banning slavery in the Northwest Territory in 1787 and stopping the importation of slaves in 1808 as soon as possible under the Constitution, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln said, in the course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln lamented how the nation had, in his day, departed from the founders' approach, the original approach to abolishing the pre-existing institution of slavery in a peaceful, gradual, lawful manner. And this is Lincoln. The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity. But now it is to be transformed into a sacred right. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity, little by little, but steadily as man's march to the grave. We have been giving up the old for the new faith. The new faith was Douglas's perversion of true popular sovereignty. Douglas's was a crude majoritarianism that rejected human equality and made the rights of Black people depend on the arbitrary will of local white majorities. Lincoln rejected this legal positivism and preached a return to what he called our ancient faith, the faith of the fathers. Lincoln charged Americans to re-adopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not only have saved the Union, but, as he put it, so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that limited the spread of slavery as a first step to its eventual demise. Douglas's don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation because it was not worthy of the founding generation. In December 1860, President-elect Abraham Lincoln received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens, who would soon become the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens wanted Lincoln to speak to the nation before his March 4th inauguration. Quoting Proverbs 25, Stephens suggested to Lincoln that a word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold and pictures of silver. This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of America's prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of the Republic, Lincoln wrote that, quote, even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. He continued, there is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all. The principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And then Lincoln alluded to that proverb that Stephens had mentioned. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which is proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution, they are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. What the country needed was not a new word from their new president, but old words, the words of their forefathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw the Declaration's principle of liberty to all as the moral compass of a constitution and union that could otherwise be misinterpreted or even broken in pursuit of tyrannical ends. Lincoln agreed with the founders that to form a more perfect American Union required compromises be made, especially regarding slavery. This is how he put it. I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality, imposed upon themselves a moral necessity to abolish slavery in a manner consistent with consent, the flip side of the equality coin. As Lincoln put it late in the war, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. This distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction Lincoln made famously in his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. With the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation already at hand, Lincoln says to Greeley publicly, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." To emancipate slaves as president in a time of war, Lincoln had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would be not only an act of justice, but also an act warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. Lincoln sought to make both his means and his ends a faithful expression of the consent of the American people. In looking to the founders, Lincoln believed Americans could reclaim the true principles of self-government and thus find common ground for promoting a common future as a people united in their self-government. Thank you.
Our second distinguished speaker today is Mark E. Steiner, an Associate Dean for Students and Professor of Law at South Texas College of Law in Houston, Texas. He received both his law degree and PhD in history from the University of Houston. Professor Steiner has qualified for membership in the State Bar of Texas Pro Bono College for the last 6 years. His community activism in Houston has been recognized with a Hero of Houston Award for his volunteer efforts after Hurricane Harvey, and in 2017, he was the first recipient of the Mark Steiner Award for Immigration Altruism, given by Houston nonprofit Baker Ripley to recognize its volunteer attorneys. Professor Steiner is the author of An Honest Calling, The Law Practice of Abraham Lincoln, and on April 30th of this year, he will receive a fitting and proper birthday gift with the publication of his new book, Lincoln and Citizenship, which is also part of the Concise Lincoln Library series of Southern Illinois University Press. And now to speak on Abraham Lincoln, colonization, and Black citizenship, we are delighted to welcome Mark Steiner to the program.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to discuss one topic from my book. It's about Lincoln's colonization, Black citizenship. The origins of Lincoln's support for colonization are murky. Lincoln was a Whig when he entered politics, and he stayed a Whig until he joined the Republican Party. And Whigs largely supported colonization. But Lincoln's first public comment about colonization wasn't until 1852. And there's no evidence Lincoln was involved with any of the Springfield-based colonization societies before 1853. Lincoln, the Whig lawyer, was nowhere to be found in the early attempts in Springfield to form colonization societies. When most of the officers of those societies, short-lived colonization societies, were Whig lawyers. In 1845, a state colonization society was formed in Springfield that actually lasted. It took Lincoln 8 years to appear before that group, a year after he first publicly addressed colonization in his eulogy to Henry Clay. In 1855, Lincoln again addressed the state society. Lincoln apparently didn't think either of these speeches was important enough to arrange for its publication, which is something he did for other speeches in this period. The Springfield correspondent for a St. Louis newspaper reported that Lincoln in this speech was emphatically non-committal. Lincoln supported the project of colonizing only if it could be accomplished without trouble, without confusion. In 1857, Lincoln became one of the 11 managers of the State Colonization Society, and he was reappointed the following year. Since the Illinois State State Colonization Society didn't seem to have accomplished a lot, these appointments appear to be honorific posts. In 1856, at least, Lincoln was a dues-paying member of the American Colonization Society. Unlike Stephen Douglas, who was listed for 7 consecutive years from 1854 to 1860 as one of the many vice presidents of the ACS, Lincoln never held any office with that organization. In the 1850s, Lincoln made a handful of speeches that addressed colonization. In his eulogy of his political hero, Henry Clay, in 1852, he discussed Clay's advocacy of colonization as part of Clay's anti-slavery principles. Lincoln repeated Clay's claim that there was a moral fitness in returning to Africa. Her children, his ancestors, have been torn from here by the ruthless hand of fraud and violence. Lincoln again discussed colonization in his Springfield speech on the Dred Scott decision in June 1857, where he briefly noted that the separation of the races is the only perfect preventive of amalgamation. Colonization was barely discussed during the Senate race the following year. In his opening speech of the Senate campaign, Lincoln said he most desired the separation of the white and black races, after declaring that blacks were entitled to their natural rights. The Republican Party platform in 1860 did not address colonization, and Lincoln's support for colonization apparently wasn't mentioned by his proxies during the campaign. So Lincoln in the 1850s wasn't an abolitionist. He wanted to stop the spread of slavery in the territories, as Lucas just talked about, and he put slavery on a course to its ultimate extinction. In an 1854 speech, he considered 3 possibilities if slavery were immediately abolished: racial subordination, equal citizenship, and colonization, and he rejected all 3. He said his first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land, but he thought colonization was impossible with immediate emancipation. He also rejected racial subordination and equal citizenship. Lincoln thought that only gradual emancipation combined with colonization was practicable, but all this was hypothetical. And the war came. Now facing real choices instead of hypothetical ones, President Lincoln was emphatically committed to colonization. In his first annual message to Congress in December 1861, Lincoln proposed sending out of the country those enslaved people who had become free because of the first Confiscation Act. Lincoln further suggested that the free colored people already in the United States be included in such colonization as far as individuals may desire. In April 1862, Congress passed a Compensated Emancipation Act for slaves in the District of Columbia that also provided funds for colonization for free black people. Lincoln issued a message to Congress about this law on the day he signed it, saying, among other things, he was gratified that the 2 principles of compensation and colonization are both recognized and practically applied in the act. The following month, Lincoln addressed an African-American delegation on the advantages of colonization. He wasn't interested in having a conversation with his guest. Lincoln explained that without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have an existence. If the presence of black people were responsible for the war, it was, quote, better for us both, therefore, to be separated. Whites and blacks simply could not exist in America. Since whites were reluctant to agree to emancipation if free blacks remained in America, Lincoln suggested to the delegation that whites would change their minds if already free blacks agreed to self-deport. Much could be accomplished, Lincoln said, if intelligent colored men, such as are before me, would move in this manner. The success of colonization could not depend on the very poor materials of those enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War, whose intellects are clouded by slavery. Lincoln stressed it was exceedingly important we have men at the beginning capable of thinking as white men, and not those who have been systematically oppressed. Lincoln's address to the black delegation was widely published. Frederick Douglass blasted Lincoln for employing the language and arguments of itinerant colonization lecturer and displaying all his inconsistencies, his pride of race and blood, his contempt for Negroes, and his canting hypocrisy. However, despite Douglass's disapproval, hundreds of free blacks in the District of Columbia expressed interest in immigration after Lincoln appointed Kansas Senator Samuel Pomeroy his agent for colonization. Pomeroy promised to establish a suitable location for a great, free, and prosperous people in Cherokee in Central America. The Cherokee scheme collapsed that fall. Among other reasons, Central American governments were opposed to the project. Consequently, not a single person immigrated there. A month after the meeting with the black delegation, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That included a promise to continue colonization efforts. The announcement of emancipation overshadowed the mention of colonization, which drew relatively little attention in the press. One Republican paper argued the proclamation wasn't radical, noting that Lincoln declared in favor in the policy of colonization, having no disposition to allow the emancipated Negroes to be thrust upon unwilling communities. Lincoln's last public pronouncement on colonization came in his annual message to Congress on December 1st, 1862. Lincoln said he would not establish a colony in any country without obtaining consent of that country and its agreement to receive and protect such immigrants as freemen. Lincoln conceded there was not much enthusiasm from free African Americans to leave the United States for Liberia or Haiti, but he was optimistically and wrongly predicted there would be an augmented and considerable migration. Lincoln also proposed a constitutional amendment on gradual emancipation that included compensation if slavery were abolished by 1900 and provided aid for colonization. Lincoln said he could not make it better known than it already is that he strongly favored colonization. However, he also hinted in this speech that he either had given up on the idea of large-scale colonization or now thought that colonization would be very gradual. Lincoln did not publicly campaign for colonization after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The planning for a colonization project off the coast of Haiti began in the fall of 1862. The immigrants departed for Haiti in April 1863, and the project ended disastrously in the spring of 1864 with Lincoln sending a vessel to rescue the surviving immigrants. Some historians believe Lincoln was feigning support for colonization to win approval for emancipation. Although Lincoln is often portrayed as a masterful strategist, it's difficult to see the political brilliance in selling Northern whites on emancipation because it would be packaged with colonization and then later abandoning colonization. Why would Lincoln assume Northern whites would forget he had promised colonization? Lincoln appears to have abandoned the notion of large-scale colonization, but this was not part of a deceptive plan. Since Lincoln had supported colonization for years, it's also unclear why his public support in the first 2 years of his administration would have been a mere feint. He certainly convinced his own cabinet that he supported colonization. In cabinet meetings in the fall of 1862, Edward Bates, as Attorney General, argued that emancipation must be accompanied by deportation. Lincoln disagreed with Bates, that colonization could be forced. Gideon Wells noted in his diary, the president objected unequivocally to compulsion. Their immigration must be voluntary and without expense to themselves. This insistence on a voluntary system would be the weak link in Lincoln's colonization schemes. Whatever black support for immigration existed in 1861 and 1862 collapsed after the failures of Cherokee and Île Vache, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the enlistment of black troops, which blacks believed would lead to citizenship. It seems likely that Lincoln changed his mind about colonization sometime after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. As Lincoln's mind changed on citizenship, it changed on colonization. 1 week after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, black abolitionist H. Douglass predicted, "This war will educate Mr. Lincoln out of his idea of the deportation of the Negro." The use of Black troops led the way for Black citizenship. Military service had long been associated with citizenship since the American Revolution. Long before the Civil War, Black abolitionists advocating equal rights had highlighted Black military service during the American Revolution and the War of 1812. The opportunity for Black men now to serve in the military would be a powerful argument for citizenship. Edward Bates, in fact, opposed Black enlistment precisely because it would lead away from colonization. Lincoln, like most white Northerners, had thought Black men lacked the requisite manly virtues to be effective soldiers. In the spring and summer of 1862, some members of his cabinet advocated the use of Black troops, which Lincoln rejected. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation did not mention the use of Black troops. The final Emancipation Proclamation did. Lincoln initially opposed the use of Black troops. Publicly, he offered political reasons. He feared he would lose the border states. In addition to political considerations, Lincoln privately had opposed arming African Americans because he believed they would quickly surrender or retreat. He said, "I'm not so sure we could do much with the Blacks. If we were to arm them, I fear that in a few weeks, the arms would be in the hands of the rebels." One of the reasons that white Northerners like Lincoln couldn't accept Black citizenship was that citizenship was interwoven with notions of masculinity. Most white Northerners believed that Black men lacked manly virtues, such as bravery. Less than 2 years after Lincoln had dismissed the very notion of Black troops because of racist stereotypes, he was referring to his Black warriors. The war had given Black men an opportunity to prove citizenship through military service. The regimental flag of the 127th United States Colored Troops carried the inscription, "We will prove ourselves men." The regimental flag of the 24th United States Colored Troops carried the inscription, let soldiers in war, be citizens in peace." So by fulfilling the highest duty of citizenship, Black men would claim the rights of citizenship. Congress had already recognized that immigrants could become citizens after military service. When Lincoln later told Douglas he had been tardy in using Black troops because of the wisdom of such a policy was doubted, he has to have been including himself among the doubters. Lincoln's doubts may have been lessened by the arguments advanced by his cabinet members and others, and by a book published in the fall of 1862 by George Livermore. When Charles Sumner sent a copy of Livermore's book to Lincoln, he called Lincoln's attention to the last half of the book on the employment of slaves and Africans during the Revolution. When Lincoln was preparing the final proclamation of emancipation, he asked if Sumner could send his copy to him, as Lincoln had mislaid his own. So perhaps it's the confluence of advice that Vince in Livermore's book, but one way or another, Lincoln changed his mind about the use of Black troops. He later answered a critic of both emancipation and the use of Black troops in an August 1863 public letter. 1 year after his patronizing lecture on colonization, Lincoln noted that some of his generals believed purely as military opinions that the emancipation policy and the use of colored troops constitute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion. In December 1860, to counter a rumor that he once told a group of free Blacks in Cincinnati he rejected all legal distinctions based on color and endorsed Black suffrage, Lincoln retorted, "I was never in a meeting of Negroes in my life." That statement was no longer true once Lincoln became president. Lincoln's view on Black citizenship also changed, and this isn't coincidental. Before he became president, Lincoln had a limited understanding of Black life, though he was in frequent contact with Black women and men. But most of the Black population in Illinois worked in menial or domestic occupations, so it wasn't until Lincoln reached Washington that he encountered Blacks who were not servants or engaged in low-status work. In Washington, Lincoln met for the first time African Americans who had political experience and wide-ranging accomplishments, and those encounters helped Lincoln change his outlook about the place of Blacks in American society. The most famous Black visitor to the Lincoln White House was Frederick Douglass. Lincoln and Douglass had 2 long meetings at the White House in August 63 and August 64. At the first meeting with Douglas, unlike at the meeting on colonization a year earlier, where Lincoln had just given a lecture, Lincoln listened with patience and silence, according to Douglas. Lincoln, perhaps for the first time in his life, took a black man's argument on politics seriously, and he gave Douglas the respect of a thoughtful response. Lincoln also entertained a delegation of blacks from Louisiana. New Orleans had a large free black community, which prepared a petition for suffrage to present to both Lincoln and Congress. Arnold Bertineau, a wine merchant, and John Baptiste Rodinot, an engineer, were selected to take the petition to Washington. They made a favorable impression on Lincoln during their interview with the president. According to Bertineau, Lincoln listened attentively to his visitors and sympathized with our object. Later that month, Lincoln privately wrote to Michael Hahn, the new governor of Louisiana. Lincoln noted that soon Louisiana would have a constitutional convention that would probably define the elective franchise. Lincoln, quote, barely suggested to Hahn that whether some of the colored people could vote, citing the very intelligent and especially those who had fought gallantly in our ranks. Lincoln may have seen black suffrage as a political necessity, telling Hahn that black voters would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom. Lincoln also met with a delegation of black Southerners from North Carolina. That group wanted to use the leverage that came from the North's growing reliance on black troops to press for black citizenship. The delegation afterwards spoke very positively about their interview with Lincoln. Clinton D. Pearson reported that Lincoln gave the committee full assurance of his sympathy in the struggle the colored people of North Carolina are now making for their rights. So Lincoln's meetings with the Douglas and the delegations from New Orleans and North Carolina may have diminished his support for colonization and support for black citizenship. Abolitionists had long recognized that white support for colonization was the greatest obstacle to black people gaining citizenship. Black leaders in their quest for citizenship argued for respectability, believing that white prejudice would be overcome when whites associated with blacks who exhibited white middle-class values. Respectability politics may have worked with Lincoln. So his interactions with African Americans changed. He had treated the deputation on colonization with condescension. He treated Douglas and the New Orleans and North Carolina delegations with respect. In his last public address, Lincoln said it was unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man in Louisiana. Referencing Louisiana constitutional qualifications for black suffrage, Lincoln said he would prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. Lincoln's call for limited black suffrage was historic. This was the first time any president had publicly endorsed any form of black suffrage. Lincoln had come a long way in a relatively short period of time. At least one member of the crowd understood how momentous Lincoln's call for limited black suffrage was. John Wilkes Booth, who was in the crowd, understood Lincoln was supporting black citizenship. Booth turned to a friend and said, "Now, by God, I will put him through. That will be the last speech he will ever make." Thank you.
Thank you so much to you both. Those were wonderful remarks. And I want to remind our viewers at home, you can post questions on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, and I will be able to ask them here on the air. So I want to start, Lucas, I need to ask you, do you have those bumper stickers available? Are you going to be selling those on eBay?
No, but I do like the design. The question will be, do I go with the tricorn hat or the top hat, the beaver skin hat? But no, not yet.
Not yet. I'll be looking out for those. Lucas, I'll start with you. So you talked about Lincoln's admiration for Jefferson and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Could you also talk about how Lincoln viewed George Washington? I think of those speeches he gave in 1861 at the beginning of the war. What did Lincoln think about George Washington during his presidency?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the most explicit thing that he does with Washington are prayer, day of national fasting, prayer, and Thanksgiving, and he used as a model one that Washington had declared when he was president. And so I talk in chapter 1 of my book about Washington's piety as a influence on Lincoln, which is interesting because Lincoln is not exactly the most orthodox Christian believer, even though he knew his Bible as well as any preacher. But I think, and of course, he makes that very famous short remarks when he leaves Springfield, saying he has a task greater than that which rested on the shoulders of Washington. And that's saying something. I mean, you don't want to say that you're better than Washington, but Lincoln says essentially on his way to the White House that he's got a more difficult task. And if we had time, we would parse the Lyceum Address of 1838 and explain what Lincoln does with Washington there. But Washington, for Lincoln, was an icon in terms of not just America as a country that came into existence as a result of throwing off despotism, but in terms of establishing what Lincoln referred to as, the greatest political security we have for civil and religious liberty. So Washington's example, I mean, Mark just mentioned, masculinity being an important point. He definitely would use Washington in that way. He would say, there's no Jackson in that, there's no Washington in that. And he's referring to these men's, their stature as masculine individuals. But what I was surprised not to find is very many quotes from any actual Washington speeches. The themes and concepts were certainly there, right? Unity. So he was certainly familiar with the farewell address, for example, and other writings, but the evidence of him citing the writings of Jefferson are myriad in comparison to the ones that he uses from Washington. So for me, Washington is more of a man of character and a man of vision. But Lincoln didn't use Washington as a wordsmith the way he did Jefferson.
Right. Mark, I want to ask you something just to sort of set the table broadly for thinking about Lincoln and citizenship. And that is, can you tell us a little bit about what citizenship meant in this era? This is before 1868 with ratification of the 14th Amendment. When we talk about citizenship in the Civil War era, what do people think of? Or what rights, what do they think of in terms of their rights that are included?
All right, so that's a very difficult question to answer. It's an elusive concept. It's a developing concept. And the thing that's most interesting in the early part of Lincoln's career, the thing we most associate with citizenship is suffrage. Mm-hmm. And in the Civil War, when African Americans are advocating for citizenship, that's one of the key things they're aiming for is the right to vote. But early on, there's not that linkage between citizenship and suffrage. So Illinois allowed non-citizens to vote. So from 1818 until their second constitution, they allowed inhabitants to vote. And several other states did the same thing. You needed to have declared your intent to become a citizen, but that's it. So with that, I think that slowly changes. And so by the Civil War, I think it's seen more as an attribute of citizenship. But in the book, I just talk about it in a broad sense of as the sense of belonging to a community or not, to a political community.
Right. Okay, good. That's helpful. I knew that some states allowed non-citizens to vote in that era. I didn't know Illinois was one of them. That's interesting.
That didn't fade away until like the 1930s, and then it's coming back a little bit in terms of letting permanent residents vote for like school elections.
Yeah, local elections and things. Yeah. Lucas, I want to build off the citizenship question, but bring it to you with thinking about Lincoln and the founding. So Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision very famously said that Black people had no rights that the white man was bound to respect. Can you talk a little bit about how Lincoln appealed to the principles of the founders in his response to the Dred Scott decision in 1857?
Yeah, he does that very explicitly, of course, in his speech, June of 1857. And he, of course, believes that Taney's reading of the Declaration of Independence is completely wrong. One thing we should remind our viewers of is that when Taney says that Negroes had no rights that the white men were bound to respect, he is claiming to express the public sentiment at the time of the founding. Now, just so happens to be pretty close to his personal opinion as well. But he, at least in strictness, if you read his opinion, and he quotes verbatim from the Declaration of Independence, and he says, he reads it first the way Lincoln reads it. He says, well, you know, if we read it in our day, all sounds like it would mean all, but we know that it can't mean all because they didn't immediately free their slaves. And this is the same opinion that Stephen Douglas has. We judge our founders' professions by their practice, if you will. Lincoln's refutation of Taney goes a long way. I mean, he builds off of Benjamin Curtis's dissent, one of the two dissenters in the Dred Scott opinion. In fact, that was Curtis's last opinion. That was his swan song. Taney did not share his opinion with any of the fellow justices. He withheld it. And he added over 14 pages to his opinion after he originally read his opinion out loud verbatim in March. That's why sometimes you'll see the decision date is March, sometimes it's May. He added, after reading the dissenters' opinions the next day in the newspaper, Curtis said, I can't work with this guy, and gave some other reasons why he was quitting the court. But at any rate, so I've lost your question. Lincoln's response to Taney. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. What he says to Taney, he says, look, it's both a response to Taney and most especially in a response to Stephen Douglas. He says, if you're going to cite their practice to judge their profession, well, then you need to cite all their practices. You need to be more comprehensive and capacious. He said, not only did the founders not treat all black people equally, they didn't treat all white people equally. In other words, how long was it until all white males at least could vote? And this is what Lincoln is suggesting. He's like, they didn't treat anybody completely equally. So you cannot draw from the simple fact that they didn't immediately emancipate all their slaves, that therefore they didn't think their slaves were entitled to their freedom. Jefferson never, for example, he never claimed that even those he enslaved didn't deserve their freedom. He just thinks whites fear for their lives if they were to free them en masse, right? We have the wolf by the ear and we can either hold him or let him go. He tells Adams or Madison in a letter that to give them freedom would be to give them freedom and a dagger. Self-preservation, right? Letter to John Holmes, self-preservation in one hand and justice in the other. And it's justice to the slave, not justice to the white enslaver. So I'm getting off on Jefferson. But Lincoln's response to Taney is that Taney is misreading the Declaration for a particular end. He's not really interested in what the Declaration meant to those who wrote it and used it to establish their freedom. He keeps referring to a mere revolutionary document. And by that, Lincoln suggests, look, we could have declared independence without saying any of that gobbledygook about human equality and individual rights and consent. We could have gone without any of that. And he says, Jefferson, all honor to Jefferson because he stuck that in there. And that's the standard by which we will measure our own progress as a self-governing people. And it was progress not just towards blacks, but to most fellow whites.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
Something about the June 1857 speech, which I found fascinating when going through this, which is that first speech, the first reaction to Dred Scott. Lincoln spends a fair amount of time on how wrong Dred Scott was on citizenship for blacks. And then during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Douglas is trying to, link Lincoln to the support for black citizenship, the one thing he doesn't do is ever use the June 1857 speech, which would have served his purposes really well. So for some reason, I mean, he mentions the later speech when he kicked off the campaign a year later, but he never mentions that speech. It's his Oppo research let him down.
That's right. And it is such a remarkable speech in that twice he uses a hypothetical African-American woman as an example of someone who deserves the rights to eat the bread that she earns by the sweat of her own brow and deserves the rights to the Declaration of Independence. I love teaching that one. I imagine you both do as well. Mark, we got a question in from a viewer about colonization. And the question is, couldn't Lincoln have simply been offering an option to those African Americans who wish to emigrate somewhere that would be a non-racist society? Can you talk a little bit more about Black views of colonization and how Lincoln is trying to pitch it in this way?
Yes. All right. I'm pretty careful in the book to talk about Lincoln abandoning large-scale colonization projects. So there are some little low-key efforts, after Emancipation Proclamation. None of them come to any kind of fruition. So colonization, support for colonization. So whites who supported colonization largely it's thinking that blacks and whites can't live together because of Black inferiority. Blacks who supported colonization, it's about how blacks and whites can't live together because of white racism. And so after Dred Scott until Emancipation Proclamation, there was a lot more support for colonization by African Americans because it's like, this is a racist society. We need to find some other place. After Emancipation Proclamation, it goes way down. I've always considered these low-key efforts that continue after Emancipation Proclamation as kind of Lincoln's plan B. He never says anything publicly about it. So he's not trying to sell it, but I think he's trying to, as the questioner suggests, he's trying to have this as an option, perhaps, that might be needed. Let's see, he's kind of like he's seeing how it's going to play out, that this actually may be needed as sort of a safety valve for those who desire it. So, but, nothing comes of those efforts. I think it's, he abandons large scale colonization because he certainly believes in Black capacity by April 1865 for sure.
Yeah. Lucas, we got a question from the audience for you, and this has to do with the relationship between Lincoln and Washington. And the question is, where would Lincoln have been drawing his understanding of Washington? Would it have been from his speeches given by Washington, biographies? What was Lincoln reading to learn about Washington?
Lincoln, of course, makes explicit reference to the Parson Weems, and we have to use scare quotes here, biography of George Washington. That's the one that produced the poppycock about the chopping the cherry tree down, among other things. Parson Weems was neither an honest biographer or a parson for that matter. I actually read that biography, and the best parts about it are the parts about the battles, of course, and about Washington's character. And the whole point, of course, of the biography is to use it as a way of teaching morals to children. And he thought he could sell the book that way. So he definitely has cited the impact that book had on him as a youth. But he read the speeches in the same way that he read the speeches and letters of Thomas Jefferson, which were public by then. He read Madison's notes, and Eliot's debates. He quotes those verbatim. And so a lot of that was really coming into the public arena I forget when Madison dies, but Madison made sure that his notes would remain confidential until he passed. I think, what is it, around the 30s?
Early 30s.
And so I'm thinking 35, but I'm not certain. Anyway, so when those became public, Washington read all that stuff. What's curious, and John, you and I have had this conversation before, is there's no indication he ever read the Federalist Papers. And there are times in Lincoln's speeches where you think, man, that concept is clearly out of Hamilton in this essay or Madison in this essay, but it's not exact, and it's odd. Here's a guy who's reading Euclid's Elements, a geometry textbook, while he's got access to the Library of Congress between 1847 and 49, his sole term in Congress. And we just have no real clear indication that he read the Federalist Papers, which strikes me as bizarre.
I do know that some people wrote to him about the Federalist and quoted it. I recall seeing a letter once in the papers at the Library of Congress where someone quoted, I believe, Federalist number 1. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, there's not a whole lot more evidence.
Wow, that's remarkable. We don't have him quoting the Federalist. Stephen Douglas has quoted the Federalist. I know I've read Stephen Douglas quote the Federalist, but and he does it in a kind of one step removed kind of way. Douglas says, well, because the Supreme Court kind of likes the Federalists, we'll mention this as an example, blah, blah, blah. So for some reason, he tries to keep it at an arm's length.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. Mark, I want to go back to the question of voting rights. And I know your book is not out yet, but I got a copy early.
People are ordering it, and I see it in their hands. So
yeah,
it's officially out the 30th, but if you order it now, like on Amazon, you'll get a copy.
So I was just leafing through it earlier today, and I saw that you talk about Lincoln and Black voting rights, and you alluded to it at the end of his life in your remarks today. Can you talk a little bit about the transformation in Lincoln's view of African-American voting rights from the 1830s or 40s into the 1860s?
All right.
I know that wasn't on colonization.
The 1830s is something else. So Lincoln and other Whigs thought they might be able to out race bait the Democrats. And so they introduced resolutions, in the Illinois House that contradicted Martin Van Buren's stance in the 1821 New York Constitutional Convention, because New York was going from property rights. If you had certain, property qualifications. So if you had property, you could vote. All right, so in 1821, as part of this, expansion of the electorate and shrinking of the electorate at the same time, the expansion part was all white men. And so the big issue at the New York Constitutional Convention is, well, what do we do with blacks who have sufficient property? So the compromise is, well, we're not going to let, in New York, we're not going to just let any black vote, but if they have property, we'll leave that part in. So the old way of doing things stays in, and then the everyone being able to vote is for white males only. All right, so Lincoln in the Sangamo Journal and a lot of these anonymous articles I think Lincoln wrote, it's just one thing after another about Martin Van Buren and blacks voting, and there's this really horrible black dialect thing that obviously Lincoln wrote that's just terrible on this. So, and then in 1840, it's still an issue, and there's a great thing about Lincoln, he secures it, not having the Federalist Papers. He gets the New York Constitutional Convention book, and in a biography of Douglas or Van Buren that he waves at Douglas, and Douglas grabs the book and throws it. So it was a big deal. Then there's not a lot said about it, and in the 1850s, he just flat out says, "Yeah, I don't support that." And then the big change is the letter to Hahn, and then the last public speech.
Right.
What about?
Go ahead, Lucas.
Sorry, Mark. I had a personal emergency in my home that I had to duck out the early part of your speech. Did you mention the Conklin letter?
I meant to, but in the interest of time.
Yeah, I know. I had to chat my speech too, but I think you have to add that. That's in August of '63. It's in the year of what I call Jubilee, the year of emancipation. And Lincoln's closing paragraph there, where he says, some of you white guys are wanting to sit this war out, and when we win this thing, there are going to be black people, right? I'm going to quote it just because, good grief, this is something that should be memorized by every American kid. He says, it will then be proved that among free men, and these are whites in Illinois, are complaining about the Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, right, there can be no successful appeal from the ballot or to the bullet. And then he says, there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue, not all that jabbering I hear out of Springfield, but silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye, and get this, well-poised bayonet. In other words, bullets gone, we go hand-to-hand combat. Well-poised bayonet, they, black men, have helped mankind on to this great consummation, while I fear there will be some white ones, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, most of the audience that's gathered, unable to forget, with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. So that letter, he said, all I ask you to do is to read it very slowly. There was like 15, actually there were scores of thousands of people who showed up to have this letter of Lincoln read out loud in public.
No, that letter is very important, because I think what it's suggesting is Lincoln understands the problem with blacks and whites living together is not going to be black capacity. That's not an issue anymore. It is going to be white racism.
Yeah.
Which is what and that's clear. And that's why I think maybe these little efforts that continue on colonization may be because he's not terribly optimistic that this is going to work out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to add to that conversation is when black men go to meet with Lincoln and ask for the right to vote, they constantly remind him, we've been loyal this whole time. There are millions of white people who are very disloyal right now, but look at us. We've never turned our back on the flag or the nation.
Wow.
If anyone should have the right to vote to help preserve the Union, it's us.
Yeah, that great line from Frederick Douglass in his 1876 oration in memory of Lincoln, right? He says, our hearts believed while they ached and bled.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's right. Well, we have time for one more question, and we got a question in from the audience. This is for you, Mark. The question is that you mentioned it was during this time in D.C. that Lincoln really met black intellectuals for the first time, most notably Frederick Douglass. Are there other notable black leaders or abolitionists that helped shape Lincoln's thinking along, I guess, the lines of citizenship or anything else related?
I think it's primarily Douglass, having a black man go toe to toe on politics with him. I think that was pretty important.
Hey, John, what do you know about Martin Delany? Because he was a colonizationist who eventually served in the war, but he met with Lincoln later, right?
Yeah, Lincoln writes a little note that says about Delany and says, you need to, this is a highly intelligent man.
Yeah.
And words to that effect.
Yeah, that's right. Delany had tried to meet with him earlier in the war, tried to get a commission earlier in the war and wasn't able to, finally met with him in February of 1865. And then shortly thereafter, he becomes the first commissioned line officer in the Union Army.
I think that's right.
But yeah, Lincoln is interacting with a lot of African Americans in Washington, D.C. Actually, going back to April of 1862, he meets with Daniel Payne, an AMA bishop, who comes to the White House and says, hey, you should sign that bill freeing the slaves in Washington. And Lincoln won't tip his hand and say whether or not he intends to do it. Although, Mark, as you mentioned in your remarks, he does then sign it, although with the colonization provision involved. Right. We do have two or three more minutes. So I want to ask just one other question, I guess, and this could be open to either of you. What is Lincoln's view of the Constitution? I know it's a big question for 2 minutes left. But Lucas, as I was listening to your remarks, I was thinking about, but the Democrats during the war say he's trampling on the Constitution. And so how do we wrestle with Lincoln's reverence for the Constitution with the very real critique that he didn't really take it that seriously?
Mark, you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
The short version is means and ends. Lincoln, early in the war, the July 4th, message to Congress in special session, and then other speeches he gives, dealing with Vallandigham and others. Lincoln reminds people that the Constitution is written with a particular aim or aims in mind, and that we have to read the passages, particular clauses accordingly. And the most difficult one for him, of course, is the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, which, John, you can do laps around me in understanding that one. You've written on it. And so for me, what Lincoln says is, surely they must have thought the following when they came up with this provision. They were coming up with these provisions not for time of peace, but for times of emergency. So it even uses that language, and therefore we have to assume, they are building, they're structuring this form of government. Not most of the time it's going to be a time of peace, but they also want it to be a real guide to them and to restrict power even in times of emergency. And what Lincoln does consistently, I think, and it's debatable, but at least he points to the Constitution and says, if you have an issue, here's where the debate has to take place. How do you interpret this particular passage? And in light of the general design of the thing, and to meet the emergency, Lincoln gives his interpretation, and they're going to be arguing about that for kingdom to come. Benjamin Curtis, whom I mentioned already, he wrote a screed against Lincoln. This guy's from New England. He's no copperhead. He's one of the dissenters in Dred Scott, and he goes after Lincoln hammer and tong for the Emancipation Proclamation, for the writ of suspending the privilege, for trying civilians in military tribunals. And so it's not just Democrats who go after Lincoln. There's a lawyers' debate publicly in terms of who understands the Constitution correctly.
Yeah, that's great. Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Just quickly, I know we're running out of time, but I think the way the Emancipation Proclamation was written shows great reverence for the Constitution, and also leads to great misunderstanding on why did he just do this part?
Yeah,
Power came from war powers. So that's all I would say. I agree with what Lucas said.
Yeah. No, I think those are great answers. And to Lucas's point, I think about how whenever Lincoln defends one of his controversial actions, he points to the text of the Constitution. So whether it's the Corning letter trying to defend habeas corpus, he says, well, the Constitution is silent as to who can do it, so I'm going to assume I can do it. Or
he drives a truck through that one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Nothing. I just said he drove a truck through that one.
He did. Yeah. It's always interesting when I assign the Corning letter to my classes, I always assign the Democratic side of that debate as well. Because I think too often we assign just Lincoln and don't see both sides of it. And when you see it together, it leads to great student discussion.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for giving wonderful remarks today. I know our audience at home enjoyed it. I want to, again, tell the audience at home to get both of these books, Lincoln and the American Founding by Lucas Morel, and Lincoln and Citizenship. You can pre-order it and get it in the mail next week by Mark Steiner, both from Southern Illinois University Press. Yeah. I want to thank Ford's Theater for everything they do to make this possible. We could not do it without them. And I want to let everyone know that we will have one more session. It'll be in 2 weeks on May 3rd. Tamika Nunley and C.R. Gibbs will be talking about the Underground Railroad and emancipation in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on May 3rd.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.